What happens when a 70-year-old retired detective stumbles upon a mystery that makes his 30-year career look like child's play? The answer will shock you, and by the end of this story, you'll understand why some cases are meant to find us, not the other way around. My name is Detective Frank Morrison, and I spent 3 decades working homicide in Chicago. I've seen it all: solved cases that made headlines, put away killers that haunted families for years. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened 6 months into my retirement. This is the story of how I solved the most mysterious case of my life while sitting in my backyard wearing pajamas. It started on a Tuesday morning in October. I was 70 years old, officially retired for exactly 184 days. Not that I was counting. My wife Margaret had been gone for 2 years, and I was still figuring out how to fill the endless hours that retirement brings. Most mornings, I'd sit on my back porch with coffee and the newspaper, watching the world wake up in my quiet suburban neighborhood. That particular morning, something was different. Mrs. Chen from next door was standing in her garden, but she wasn't gardening. She was just standing there, staring at something in the flower bed. Now, Mrs. Chen is 82 years old, moved here from Taiwan 40 years ago, and in all my years living next to her, I'd never seen her stand still for more than 30 seconds. This woman moves like she's got a personal vendetta against idle time. I called out to her, "Morning, Mrs. Chen. Everything all right over there?" She looked up at me with this expression I'd seen 1,000 times before, but never on a civilian's face. It was the look of someone who'd stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. As a detective, you learn to read faces like books, and Mrs. Chen's face was screaming that she'd found something significant. "Mr. Frank," she said, her voice carrying that slight tremor that comes with age and concern, "I think you should see this." Now, here's where most retired folks would probably say something like, "I'm sure it's nothing," or "call the police." But once you've been a detective for 30 years, curiosity isn't just a trait, it's a compulsion. It's like a muscle that never stops flexing, always looking for the next puzzle to solve. I walked over to Mrs. Chen's garden, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. Buried about 6 inches deep in her prized rose garden was a small metal box, maybe 8 inches square. But it wasn't just any box. This was a time capsule, and from the look of the metal and the way it was corroded, it had been there for decades. "I was planting new bulbs," Mrs. Chen explained, "and my shovel hit something hard. When I dug it up, I found this." The box was locked, but the lock was old and rusted. Mrs. Chen had already managed to pry it open, and inside was something that made my detective instincts go into overdrive. There were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a confession letter. But here's the thing that made my heart rate spike. The confession was signed by Harold Grimsby, and I knew that name. Harold Grimsby was a suspect in a series of burglaries that had plagued our neighborhood in the 1970s. He was questioned multiple times, but there was never enough evidence to charge him. The case went cold, and Grimsby disappeared from Chicago sometime in the late 70s. But according to this confession, he hadn't just been guilty of burglary. He'd been guilty of murder. The confession detailed how Grimsby had killed a man named Thomas Kellerman during a burglary gone wrong in 1974. The victim's name didn't ring a bell immediately, but the address did. It was 3 blocks from where I was standing, and the house had been torn down and rebuilt in the 80s. Now, most people would take this straight to the police, but I had a problem. The confession was nearly 50 years old, the suspect was long gone, and there was no way to verify if any of this was real. For all I knew, this could be someone's idea of a prank, a piece of creative writing, or the ravings of someone with mental illness. But something about the details in the confession felt authentic. Grimsby described the victim's house layout, mentioned specific items that were stolen, and provided details about the murder that had a ring of truth to them. As I read through the confession, I could feel my old detective brain kicking into high gear. I asked Mrs. Chen if I could borrow the box for a few days. She agreed, probably relieved to have someone else take responsibility for this unexpected discovery. I spent the rest of that day poring over the contents, and what I found made me realize this wasn't just a cold case. It was a case that had never been reported. The photographs in the box showed a man who matched Grimsby's description, standing in front of various houses in our neighborhood. There were detailed notes about the residents' schedules, their security systems, and their valuables. This wasn't just a confession. It was a criminal's complete operational records. But here's where things got really interesting. Among the photographs was one that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of my own house taken from the backyard, with notes about when Margaret and I left for work each day. Harold Grimsby had been casing my house in the 1970s, and I'd never known it. The emotional impact of this discovery was overwhelming. Here I was, a retired detective who thought he'd seen everything, finding out that a criminal had been watching my family decades ago. It felt like a violation that transcended time, a reminder that evil can lurk in the shadows of our everyday lives without us ever knowing. But the confession raised more questions than it answered. If Thomas Kellerman had been murdered in 1974, why was there no missing person report? Why had no one ever reported the crime? And most importantly, what had happened to Harold Grimsby? I decided to do what any self-respecting retired detective would do. I launched my own investigation. I started with the Chicago Police Department's cold case files, but there was no record of Thomas Kellerman's death. I checked missing person reports from the mid-70s, but found nothing. It was as if Thomas Kellerman had never existed. Then I had a breakthrough. I remembered that in the 1970s, not all deaths were reported to the police immediately. Some families, particularly those dealing with shame or scandal, might delay reporting or try to handle things privately. I decided to check death certificates and obituaries from 1974. After 3 days of searching through microfilm at the library, I found it. Thomas Kellerman, age 34, died in October 1974. Cause of death was listed as accidental. The obituary was brief and mentioned that he was survived by a sister in Milwaukee. The pieces were starting to come together, but I still had more questions. How had Grimsby's confession ended up buried in Mrs. Chen's garden? And why had the family reported Thomas Kellerman's death as accidental when, according to the confession, he'd been murdered? I decided to track down Thomas Kellerman's sister in Milwaukee. After some detective work, I found her living in a nursing home. Her name was Dorothy Kellerman Walsh, and she was 89 years old. When I called the nursing home and explained that I was a retired detective investigating her brother's death, she agreed to speak with me. The conversation I had with Dorothy changed everything. She told me that her brother Thomas had been involved with some bad people in the 70s, and that the family had always suspected his death wasn't accidental. But when the police investigated, they found no evidence of foul play, and the family was pressured to accept the accidental death ruling. We knew someone had killed Tommy, Dorothy told me over the phone, her voice still sharp despite her age. But the police said there was no evidence, and we didn't know how to prove it. We were just grateful to have his body back for a proper burial. This revelation hit me like a freight train. Here was a family that had lived for nearly 50 years knowing their loved one had been murdered, but unable to prove it. And now, decades later, I'd literally stumbled onto the evidence they'd needed. But Dorothy told me something else that made this case even more complex. She said that about a year after Thomas's death, a man had approached her claiming to know what really happened to her brother. The man said he had information about the murder, but he wanted money in exchange for the details. Dorothy's family didn't have much money, and they refused to pay. The man disappeared, and they never saw him again. "Can you describe this man?" I asked Dorothy. "Oh, I'll never forget him," she said. "He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair and a scar on his left cheek. He said his name was Harold something." My heart nearly stopped. Harold Grimsby had tried to extort money from the victim's family. This wasn't just a murder case. It was a case involving extortion, cover-up, and a criminal who had disappeared with evidence that could have brought closure to a grieving family. I spent the next week digging deeper into Harold Grimsby's background. What I found painted a picture of a career criminal who had been involved in burglaries, extortion, and possibly other violent crimes throughout the 1970s. But in 1978, Harold Grimsby simply vanished from all record. Then I had another breakthrough. While searching through old property records, I discovered that the house where Mrs. Chen now lived had been owned by Harold Grimsby's aunt in the 1970s. She died in 1977, and the house had been sold to Mrs. Chen's family in 1978. The timeline was becoming clear. Harold Grimsby had buried the confession in his aunt's backyard sometime before her death in 1977. He'd probably intended to retrieve it later, but something had prevented him from doing so. Maybe he'd died. Maybe he'd been arrested for other crimes. Or maybe he'd simply fled Chicago and never looked back. But why bury the confessions at all? As I read through Grimsby's notes more carefully, I found the answer. He'd been planning to use the confession as leverage. The detailed records of his crimes weren't just mementos. They were insurance policies. If he ever got caught for other crimes, he could trade this information for a lighter sentence. The confession also revealed something that made me realize the full scope of Grimsby's criminal enterprise. Thomas Kellerman hadn't been a random victim. He'd been targeted because he'd witnessed one of Grimsby's earlier burglaries and had threatened to go to the police. The murder was committed to silence a witness, making it a premeditated crime rather than a burglary gone wrong. With this new information, I faced a dilemma. The confession provided closure for the Kellerman family, but Harold Grimsby was likely dead after nearly 50 years. There was no one left to prosecute, no justice to be served in the traditional sense. But there was still the matter of giving the family the truth they'd been denied for decades. I called Dorothy Kellerman Walsh again and asked if she'd like to hear the full story of what happened to her brother. She said yes, and I spent 2 hours on the phone with her, reading portions of the confession and explaining what I'd discovered. The emotional impact of that conversation was profound. Here was a woman who had lived her entire adult life knowing her brother had been murdered but unable to prove it. And now, at 89 years old, she finally had the truth. I always knew Tommy didn't die in an accident, she told me, her voice breaking with emotion. He was too careful, too smart. Someone killed him, and now I finally know who and why. Dorothy asked me to send her copies of the confession and the other evidence. She wanted to share it with the rest of the family, to finally give them the closure they'd been seeking for 50 years. But there was one more surprise in store. While organizing the evidence to send to Dorothy, I discovered something I'd missed in my initial examination of the box. Hidden in a false bottom was a small key and a piece of paper with an address. The address was for a storage facility that had been operating in Chicago since the 1960s. The key was for Unit 247. My detective instincts told me this was significant, but I wasn't sure how to proceed. The storage facility was still in operation, but accessing someone else's unit would require legal authority I no longer had. I decided to contact my former partner, Detective Ray Castellanos, who was still working cold cases for the Chicago PD. I explained the situation to him, and he agreed to help me investigate the storage unit legally. What we found in Unit 247 was astounding. Harold Grimsby had been storing evidence from dozens of crimes committed throughout the 1970s. There were photographs, documents, stolen items, and detailed records of burglaries, extortion schemes, and other criminal activities. It was like discovering a criminal's private museum. Among the items was a gun that forensics later matched to the murder of Thomas Kellerman. There were also items that linked Grimsby to at least 6 other unsolved crimes from the same era. The storage unit was a treasure trove of evidence that could potentially solve multiple cold cases. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was a journal that Grimsby had been keeping. The final entry, dated March 15th, 1978, revealed what had happened to him. He'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer and had decided to disappear rather than face arrest for his crimes. The journal indicated that he'd planned to retrieve the confession from his aunt's backyard and destroy all evidence of his criminal activities. But I'm too weak now, the final entry read. The cancer is winning, and I don't have the strength to dig up the box. Maybe it's better this way. Maybe someone will find it someday and give that family the truth they deserve. Harold Grimsby had died in a hospital in Phoenix, Arizona in April 1978 under an assumed name. He'd taken his secrets with him, never knowing that his carefully hidden evidence would eventually surface to provide closure for his victims' families. The discovery of the storage unit evidence allowed the Chicago Police Department to officially close 7 cold cases, including the murder of Thomas Kellerman. The cases were classified as cleared by death of offender, meaning that while the perpetrator couldn't be prosecuted, the crimes had been solved. For Dorothy Kellerman Walsh, the resolution brought a peace she'd never expected to find. After all these years, she told me in our final conversation, I finally have answers. Tommy can rest in peace now, and so can I. The experience taught me something profound about the nature of justice and closure. Sometimes the most important cases aren't solved in interrogation rooms or courtrooms. Sometimes they're solved by retired detectives in their pajamas, by elderly neighbors planting flowers, and by families who never stop believing in the truth. As I sit here today, still retired, but somehow more fulfilled than I was 6 months ago, I'm reminded that being a detective isn't just a job, it's a calling. Even in retirement, even at 70 years old, there are still mysteries to solve, still families seeking answers, still truths waiting to be discovered. The metal box that Mrs. Chen found in her garden is now part of the evidence file at the Chicago Police Department, but the impact of its discovery will last forever. 7 families finally have closure, 7 cold cases have been solved, and 1 retired detective learned that sometimes the most important work we do happens when we're not officially working at all. This case reminded me why I became a detective in the first place: to find truth in the darkness, to give voice to the voiceless, and to ensure that justice, even delayed, is never denied. Harold Grimsby may have escaped earthly justice, but he couldn't escape the truth. And sometimes, that's the most important justice of all.